and from the board on evaluation of my performance was agreeable to them, so we could follow that process. That will include a 360 evaluation, so a survey out to the staff here on how I am doing as the executive director, so the board can be informed in November during that review. And then presented the director's report, which is attached here in the CAC agenda. So if there's any questions on the director's report or other things from the board meeting, happy to share out. And then Kelly, anything, or you weren't there, Evelina, you shared, yes. Anything from your recall or reflection that was there that's notable for the CAC?
You mentioned something about PFAS.
Yes.
Was discussed, yeah.
So that was part of the Oregon legislative update. So there was early on in the legislative cycle a bill, I forget which one it was, for some PFAS monitoring and regulation in Oregon. That bill did not, it died in committee, but Oregon has rulemaking underway with a public comment this spring and this fall likely to come out with some rules related to PFAS. How much of that will be an air component or a water quality component? I think it'll be a little bit more water quality component focused, but there was discussion during the long session in Oregon on PFAS.
Yeah, I guess you can read that out. That's what I had in the notes pretty much.
Cool.
I'd be interested in learning more about the PERS, like you guys, what that really is all about.
So it's, I wish I could remember the name of the, let's see, I have the staff report right here. Let me just pull it up. So when you are a PERS employer, you have a amount of dollars and cents that a staff person, when they enter the pension program, that PERS would have to pay out to that individual who is on the pension. And so there's an amount of dollars that we have to pay to PERS to try to make sure that PERS is being supported in the pension payouts to folks. And so the board's interest was to make sure that whatever that dollar amount is, that in our reserves, we have that set aside so that we can be sure that if the need is to pay out on that, we have the ability to do so. So the thought is we could take two approaches where we just give the dollars to PERS up front and say, here you go, have it. If we were to take that approach, ARAPA would not be able to get those dollars and cents back if there was a need. So the other approach that the board was more interested in is we still take that amount and we put it in what's called an LGIP savings account where we still have access to it, but it just has board sort of authority over it. So if there was ever a need where we needed to tap into those reserves for some reason, we could get permission from the board to do so.
Would either of those funds be interest bearing?
Yes, well, that was kind of, we want to keep it in an LGIP account because we can still collect interest on it, as opposed to if we just gave it to PERS, we would not be able to do that. Or if there was whatever the circumstance need may be, those dollars would be inaccessible to us, but they still are. We just have to engage with the board on wanting to tap into that. So that was essentially the high level reflection.
So it's not for former employees getting PERS, it's for future employees or existing employees who are set to retire?
It's both. It's the amount is kind of if all of ARAPA staff or if the organization was to essentially close, we would have this much liability that this organization would need to act on. And so the likelihood of that being the case seems to be relatively small. But the board, and I agree, is good practice for us to see what that amount is. Let's put a specific earmark on those dollars. So that way, if a hypothetical circumstance ever arises, we would be in a good place to navigate it.
Never heard of that before.
PERS is complicated, I have learned, and I'm grateful for the program as someone who's a PERS employee myself. I think it provides a lot of great benefits. It's an attractive component for us to have as an employer in terms of trying to bring skillful, smart, public service-oriented people to our organization, but it is complicated.
Well, it's changed a lot over time, the different tiers and whatnot. Because when I was with ODOT, I was part of PERS, which you can't cash out, so I have to maintain for my, what was put in. I don't ever remember hearing about that. So.
Yeah, I think this is more just an administrative kind of like employer component of assuring that PERS is able to be a successful program in the state of Oregon and what our stake as a PERS employer is in assuring that success.
Yeah, there's been a lot of problems nationwide with underfunded pension plans, so it's a really good thing that
One of
everybody's
the
on top of it.
components of our current circumstance in PERS is most of our employees who are in PERS are what's called OPSERP, which is not a tier 1 or tier 2. It's a OPSERP program, which the fine specifics of what the program offers and the benefits of it are designed to start to address some of that unfunded that is seen nationwide with some pension programs.
All right. Any questions about that or comments about the board meeting?
I think Chris is here now. He joined. Oh, I thought I saw something that showed.
Yeah, he was up there.
Just says
It's
he has
not,
access to the
it's about the
chat.
chat. It has nothing to do with him being there.
Gotcha.
Interesting.
Okay.
It's because the link is the same throughout every single meeting. I didn't change the link, so
Okay.
that's from the last meeting.
Cool. Okay.
Fighting fires.
Well, I think what that means is if we put something in the chat on Chris's
Oh.
Teams, he would see
Oh.
that chat pop up.
Ah,
So it's a way to maintain that between meeting cycles, yeah.
All right. Should we move on to the 2024 annual report review? So if you want to bring this up on the main screen, if people had a chance to look at this.
is it the annual report?
Absolutely. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I should just go through it. We just want to I have to say I was really impressed. This is a really, really fun one to read. So first off, kudos to you guys.
Matt?
Matt, just the formatting of it, the look of it.
It's
attractive. It is attractive and it was just, if you're not bombarded with information, there's plenty of information, but it's split up really, really well. So I figure we just kind of go through it and, appreciate comments and feedback, right, from people on, and looking
Absolutely.
through this. So.
Yeah, I appreciate the approach that Matt has brought from a public outreach, public affairs perspective since he started is trying to engage in a kind of like a friendly uncle or friendly neighbor kind of like tone and style of making it impactful and meaningful, not overly technical or complicated. And I think that this embodies that effort. So, yeah.
Yeah, plenty of information, nice updates. So having the table of contents obviously is really handy as well. And then, of course, the opening director's message. I thought that was pretty great. You have a hard time beating that one next year.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, yes.
It was my first, I was like, wow.
We'll have some things
Very
to be proud of that we'll
impressive.
talk about, so for sure.
No doubt, no doubt. But it starts off in a very friendly tone, having the pictures, having this like message. I just thought that was really a great kind of introduction to kind of setting this thing up. So I was trying to recall, I mean, of course, there's been annual reports before, but this is definitely a pretty big difference. So
Was there any, like, looking through it, any questions or any things that came up or things that brought interest in or like said, hey, El Rapa should elaborate or expand or anything to that degree?
In the summary about air monitoring on page 2, it says that data would be available in mid-2025 from air monitoring for the, I think the Bethel and the youth farm sites. Is that something that's been released?
Yeah, so the air toxics, the hazardous air pollutants, I think is what you're referring to there, into that air monitoring. We have not the full completed year just yet. We have, I think, the first 3 quarters that are QA, QC'd. So our process is we, at least in air toxics monitoring, the way it works is you have a sampler. So air will go into whether it's called a Suma canister or like a sponge that essentially absorbs the flow that you push through it over a set period of time. And then that gets shipped off to a laboratory. We utilize DEQ's lab where they go through and they analyze and they look and provide that data. Because we take the cost-effective approach and use DEQ's lab for that work, the rate at which they publish the data is slower. We have the first 3 quarters available, and when we have the 4th quarter available, we'll publish it all at once. But if there's a need or interest to want to see the things that have been QA/QC'd, we have that. We can't share it. We're just waiting until it's a full year completed.
And the DEQ disruption with their data breach
yes.
also exacerbated the timeline, unfortunately. So, yeah, but Lance has said he's looked through the first 3 quarters and was very pleased that it's pretty much, there's not really anything of any concern to his, discretion looking at it, that, so it's like no news is good news from what he's seeing on it thus far.
The Highway 99 monitor is the long-term trend site, so that's where we'll have prior years to look to compare to. The youth farm in Springfield, that was just the 1 year. So it'll be interesting to see what that data looks like from an hazardous air pollutants perspective for that part of Springfield. We had 2 air toxics monitoring sites in Lane County, and part of that was our leveraging of DEQ doing the lab work, which allowed us to have a second air toxics monitor. The Highway 99 site is our long-term trend site, and then the other one was one that we viewed in recent years as something that we could move around a little bit more. It's not mobile by any sense, but we can move it to different locations. So in 2022 to 2023, we had it in Oak Ridge, which was great because we caught some wildfire smoke, and there's no real industry influence on that. So that hazardous air pollutant profile was really interesting. And what is the HAPs that are present in wildfire smoke? Then after we had that there for about 1.5 years, we wanted to move it to a different place. And we felt that Springfield, partly due to some of the feedback that we had collected from folks, comments that people had provided to us, and just general directions or interest and requests, we felt that would be a real appropriate place to put it. So we put it there. At this point, we only have the one Highway 99 monitor. As from a monetary perspective, it is expensive to run both of these monitors. So we don't have 2 different air toxic sites that we're running at the moment. We just have the one long-term trend site in Highway 99, which I think is a place that EPA would like it to be. But I agree, it's ideal in the sense that it's in a place where industry is more present in our part of the community or in our part of the Oregon. And there are community members who live in close proximity to that area. So I think understanding what that hazardous air pollutant profile is important data for us to be collecting.
But they're not both. They are both up and running, or they're not both?
Just the one, just the Highway 99 site. Yes, we discontinued that second monitoring at Springfield's youth farm.
But it's all the equipment still available if you need to set it up?
Yes, we could. It really is the maintenance and lab work that is the costly, expensive component of doing that work, and that was more from a DEQ's lab, has quite a bit of work that they need to do, and their ability to process that second set of lab was challenging for them. And so that's where the real catalyst for wanting to go from 2 to 1.
So would additional funding help with that, or it's capacity, or both?
A little bit of both. Like if we wanted to engage or explore that, we would have to find our own lab to do that. And then that would be us taking on a higher cost for that lab work, as opposed to the more cost-effective approach, which is utilizing DEQ's lab to do that analysis.
About $100,000 per year for the lab for the one toxic site.
Okay. No, the idea of being able to move it to areas where you get, multiple complaints or multiple concerns is a very clever,
Yes.
neat approach to community.
In
Anyway,
2022.
but yeah, that's a big dollar.
When we moved it to Oak Ridge, I think that there was maybe from others who work in this industry a little bit of a head scratching, in the sense of like, there's not a lot of people necessarily who live there. There's no industry influence, so why put expensive, air sampling in that location? But the intent was to try to understand, like in wildfire smoke, we talk about particulate matter, which is just particles of a certain size. But things like naphthalene, benzene, which was from that data showed that wildfire smoke, at least if it's the Willamette National Forest burning, has elevated levels of benzene. That was the insight and the motivation for wanting to do that, was to try to get a better sense of what is all Oregonians breathe wildfire smoke during wildfire season if we have a bad year, but what beyond particulate matter is in that exposure. That's the insight. Oregon Health Authority was very interested in that data, and they are doing what a ASTER, I forget what it stands for. It's not a formal ASTER study, but it's a light ASTER study to try to pick apart what is that health risk component to that exposure. That's work that they're just taking on because that's their mission that they want to do. And when they have that ready, we of course will be very happy to share it and present what those insights are.
So what's the source for the benzene? Is that common with wildfire smoke?
Well, apparently so. I don't think that it's like it was the 2022 Cedar Creek wildfire was the smoke that was mostly being picked up. So there was not homes or anything in that fire that was burning. It was all Willamette National Forest. So what exactly is that benzene source? That's a good question. But presumably organic materials in the forest that's being burned. Yeah.
Well, I'd say going back to the executive summary, these are nice, brief, but very informative. We talk, we go through and look at these things individually, but to see them summarized was pretty great. So to see as many asbestos abatement notices, I didn't realize, they add up, when you see them like that. And then of course the summary of the permits. So. Let's see. Summary of the air monitoring, the 9 stations, and then of course the commercial sensors, that's a purple air, right?
Yes,
Okay.
so the purple air sensors are not any sort of regulatory thing that can come from that, but we do see them as real good ways to try to fill in some of the gaps between the regulatory monitoring. And I think they're very helpful tools for public messaging on what the air quality is.
Is there an issue with the one at the Amazon Dog Park? I've noticed it's sky high on a few reports, when nothing else is.
Nothing objectively right now at that point, but I'll make a note here on the Amazon. I don't know if that is
Like sky high.
Like it may have been an anomaly potentially.
I think potentially something went wrong with it.
Well, one of the things about the commercial air sensors or like purple air sensors is one, they are not as, their method of monitoring isn't as robust as the more expensive level of monitoring. Two, because they're commercially available, anybody can buy one and they can do things like install it outside their home, and then their grill is like right below it. And so anytime they're cooking, you can see that spike in elevation. So it's harder to QA/QC that data set because of the many variables and not as much structure in the placement of it that you see on the regulatory side of that monitoring.
Yeah, I did that to myself once. Flare outside and then did some smoking and whoa, what's going on?
Yes.
Oh yeah, I'm doing the smoking right there, not too far from there.
I have a purple air sensor indoors, and it always turns mad red at me whenever we're cooking on a pan. Particularly if you're cooking with oil on a pan, it doesn't like that. Yes.
Sensitive,
Mhm.
good way to test it.
I'm curious, is there anything, I'm assuming occasionally you discuss El Rapa outside of this meeting, with neighbors and coworkers, et cetera. Is there any kind of information or talking points that you find a lot of folks are asking of you that maybe isn't in this document that would be helpful, or?
Well, maybe it may be in the document, I might have missed it, but the e-commerce facility kind of highlighted that issue about not having, jurisdiction really because of we're not in a non-attainment situation with carbon monoxide and the parking lot and the number of vehicles and all that for that proposed facility. So that doesn't really trigger any triggers a review, but not an actual permit. That's the way I understand it.
Yeah, so that's what you're speaking to, which is not in the annual report, and that's more of a recent development, but that's an indirect source permit, or not permit, but indirect source review. So that's our Title 20 of our rules and regulations. And it's an older title that was driven from back to similarly to the vehicle inspection program. The motivation for Oregon having vehicle inspection programs was from an ozone, but also a carbon monoxide perspective. And so El Rapa, as Lane County at the time, were having some reflections of, is there a CO issue in Lane County? And part of that process was determined that there is, and our approach of addressing it is through managing of traffic. So installing or working with the city of Eugene to improve traffic flow, so less cars that are parked on the road that are having exhaust. And then part of that is if there's a big parking lot and lots of vehicles are going to be going into that parking lot, are the emissions from that vehicles going to create a carbon monoxide issue for Lane County? And so our review today in 2025 is looking through these 1970 driven rules to say, are the cars of 2025 in that parking lot of that size going to create a carbon monoxide issue against the National Ambient Air Quality Standards? And the reflection on that is our part of that process of doing that. And the outcome is it will not, but still because of our titles, we go through that process of the public comment and soliciting feedback and interest from the community.
So using that as an example of what people can be confused at in the community as to what El Rapa involvement in a project means, you know. So just in general, it could be that conservation could be applied to any project.
Yeah, and I do view the, because a lot of times, and I can understand why people can have a misunderstanding of what our scope and role is in like a specific example of an indirect source review. Because rules and regulations and the Clean Air Act is complicated, and it's easy to just understand or have a reflection of like, here's an authority that's saying yes, no, and the fine nuance of what our scope is and what our scope is not is something that if you're just an average person living your life in Lane County, you are not going to have that nuance in the front of your brain. And so we see it, we're actually talking about this morning. I see it as a real opportunity to put together some well-crafted materials. So folks who are interested, who provided comment to us, who are engaged and want to know more about this, can be an opportunity to provide some helpful materials so they can better understand what our scope is, but also just generally the process on these items so they can be better prepared to be engaged on future instances if they come up again.
Regarding that, so I noticed you spoke about the cars in the parking lot. Would that also include that everything's okay with the amount of trucks that will go in and out of there? And then also wondering if there's anything to do with the construction of a facility of that size, including like the parking lot paving or anything like that. No regulatory
Oversight.
of like those things.
Not from El Rapa. So in terms of like what vehicles are they using? Are they electric vehicles? Are they gas vehicles and distributing? What is the impact on Highway 99 and the traffic? That our Title 20 does not give us any scope in that direction. In terms of how big is the facility and what are the permits part of that, that is more of a municipality and what their reflection from oversight. Ours is specifically on how big is the parking lot and how many cars from employees commuting there is the emissions from those vehicles going to create an issue with the CO. One of the items that we're, I think, doing is assessing all of those comments. The public comment period closed on the 22nd. So it's going through the comments that we received, digesting them and seeing how we can, from those comments within the scope of our authority, we be responsive and pivot and ask the facility to take further actions depending upon what our scope is. Some things are the requests like they should install a traffic light at this place where it is. That would be something that's outside of our ability to require the facility to do something. So we can't engage on that. But what is within our scope, we need to assess those comments, understand them, and then pivot if necessary.
One thing that I thought, you just go into that is that Max and I had been looking and, DEQ does everything outside of Lake County and they will occasionally have to get into an ISCP permit as well. Their thresholds now, as of today, because they've updated theirs more recently than ourselves. I think the number of parking stalls now, Max, it's significantly more than our threshold's 250, is that correct? And now, I can't remember what their
There's
threshold is.
1,000, yeah, spaces. So yeah, they haven't issued a new indirect source construction permit for 25 years or so. They've had a few modified ones for like Intel and Nike. But yeah, they have a much higher threshold. Through this empirical or, data studies they've done that they show that, these smaller parking lots aren't going to even remotely approach causing or contributing an exceedance of a CO max.
And I think why that's important is that as much as we are trying to be proactive in protecting our airshed and doing that, we can attribute a lot of that improvement or lower level of concern where it's like, wow, we could have up to 1,000 parking lots, is that the efficiencies, catalytic converters, things like that that are now required into vehicles have done such a good job of minimizing the amount of pollution a vehicle puts out, that a lot of that work, thankfully, is already being accomplished without, a local air agency or DEQ having to be really nervous about that. So it doesn't mean that it's zero by any means, but the amount of emissions that are coming out of a tailpipe are markedly lower than they were when these laws were crafted. So
Yeah, the vehicle running in the 1970s and 1980s is not generally the same type of vehicle that's running today. I do think that we can be more stringent than the state. And so our smaller, like what size of a parking lot are we engaging on is an example of us being more stringent than the state. And then just vehicle emission regulations, how it works in the United States is like LRAPA or even DEQ do not regulate vehicle emissions per se. There is a vehicle inspection program, but our focus is on stationary sources of emissions. And broadly, vehicle emissions is a federal regulatory approach, which is the federal government says to car manufacturers, new cars rolling off the line have to meet these ever increasing efficiency standards. So then over time, as older cars retire from the roadways, and the cars that are coming on are more efficient and less polluted.
Which is a better approach.
I think it's easier to, like, for us to require a car manufacturer, something like that would be challenging from our perspective, and could be complicating from a car manufacturer. Well, in Lane County, we have to meet these standards, but in California, it's different. In Nevada, it's different. That's where a federal approach is more of a unifying, and we do benefit, like LRAPA, DEQ, instead of having to really engage on some of these parking lot discussions. It's an easier reflection for us because of those federal efforts to reduce emissions from vehicles. Because transportation, in an emissions inventory of how much air pollution is being created, transportation is still a very large sector of that.
So before we move on, you asked, I'll go back to the original question, I guess one that's been coming up that of course doesn't really apply to this, just odors. And how I do think that they're just in the community, it's just misconceptions on a lot of things. Not all dust is silica dust. Not all odors are toxic chemicals. And that's something that I think having a little bit more just information would be really helpful, not only for complaints and that type of thing, because just, some of our recent conversations about these complaints and about odor and how you guys don't regulate, but maybe, something a little bit more on that. Because I deal with that even with dust. I was like, oh, you're using, like, we've tested our dust, like it's, it's not detect these types of things, like not all dust, there's organic dust, there's these different types of things, but similar, it's odors, right? Just because it smells bad doesn't mean it's actually like hurting us.
And that's helpful feedback. And two is it's challenging to regulate odor. I am tentatively or a little aware of, like, in the Northeast where they try to have some odor regulations and it kind of involves a panel to review. But an odor is a subjective experience, and we like to operate in the objective space. And so it's hard to regulate off of something so subjective. And so instead, it's easier to regulate processes that might create odors than it is to regulate odors themselves.
Yeah, and not, again, not applicable to this, but like just as far as that,
It might be
It does-
a good page to have in there for just kind of context, right? Because for me, it is here's what's happened in the year, but I also want it to be something that if someone that's new to the county, we're like, hey, what do you guys do? Well, here's the last annual report, and it gives them kind of just a snippet of an understanding of what we've been
Yeah.
up to.
Mhm.
Having something that speaks to that could be pretty beneficial.
Well, similar to the dust, do you often get complaints about people perceiving opacity when it's actually water vapor?
Yes, yes, people will see water vapor coming out of a stack and assume that that is a bunch of smoke. And so they will call, and that is actually a somewhat regular conversation that we have with people.
That's good.
Yeah,
That
I'm going
means-
to smoke school.
Actually, that's a great point though, right? Just information, because it's easy to think.
Right, and if you're just an average Lane County resident and you're living your life and, you're not a Clean Air Act kind of oriented person, but you do live or drive by this facility and you see something coming out of what we call smokestacks, just in our kind of normal vernacular, I can very much understand why people draw that conclusion.
It's true. I had a friend visit this weekend. We had lots of interesting conversations just about that. She's like, well, Kelly, you know a lot of these weird particulars that the average person doesn't know. Like, well, that's probably true, but like, it would be great if they knew a little, like, if we could like spread the information.
I find myself just in my own personal relationships, so like with my husband or with my family, sometimes I find myself going off in the dry speak, which is the, rules and regulations. I'm like, this is this really interesting thing, and they're like, it is not interesting.
Exactly, that's exactly right. Well, I also would comment that I thought it was really great that you presented the data with the smoke, with the wildfire data and without. That was really
Yes.
pretty fantastic to see. I think that's important
Yes.
for people to see that. It helps too, to just kind of recognize, on a broader scale, again, outside your purview, but the importance of the forests and management and, from a community standpoint, seeing that, the impact that has.
I appreciate that, Kelly, and because, so again, our motivation or our mission is to improve air quality to meet the national ambient air quality standards. And when we have and so if you are not meeting the national ambient air quality standards, you go into what's considered to be non-attainment. And if you are non-attainment, it can be challenging from an economic development perspective because getting a permit in those non-attainment areas can be quite a bit more difficult. And because of that, the EPA or the Clean Air Act has a vehicle called an exceptional events where you can go from a regulatory perspective and say, hey, this data we have here is not necessarily human caused. I know that from a climate change perspective, you can make an argument that it is, but from a wildfire, it's not an industry, it's not a factory, it's not manufacturing. And the community, our region, shouldn't be having to go through these economic development disadvantages for this. So there's a vehicle called exceptional events where the EPA can take that data and say, we're not going to count this against an attainment designation. However, we all here as Lane County residents are still exposed to that. We still have to live and breathe that. And I think it's really important that we recognize that here's what the official from a attainment, non-attainment line is, but we need to always have next to it here's the lived experience of the community, because wildfire smoke is an ongoing source of air pollution. And in my view, that is the leading edge from a regulatory perspective. How do we address it? And it's a lot more complicated than having a conversation with the business about what their emissions are, because you start getting into land use, into forest versus public lands, and there's a lot more collaboration that's needed to make that work.
So kind of closing the loop, when I first read this, I'll admit, a little confused if that was total days or annual days. But then I figure it must be like literally between 1985 and 2012, there were only 3 days, not 3 per year, right?
Yeah, it's
Okay,
3
3
days
total.
total.
Okay, that would be just one clarifying thing that like, I interpreted it that way, but then I questioned, like, that's an incredible jump. If it's 3 days total in that many years versus average, so. And then I love seeing, the org chart and all that. I think having the board members on, I think that was all really great for,
Thank you for those that provided headshots. Appreciate that.
So, yeah, any other thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I think it's very detailed. I like the graphs. Everything is great.
Lance's hard work.
The layout was really great.
Graphs and all that.
Yeah,
Graphs and charts.
I was really struck by the complaint table, how there seemed to be, I don't know, fads or events that one year will have a big jump in one category of complaint, which reminds me of the work we did a couple months ago, and I think that was good to address that.
Yeah,
Keep
one
track
of
or repeat.
the notable items was, I think 2020 is, of course, such a remarkable year in many different ways, but there was a lot more elevated outdoor burning complaints in 2020. And I think that that can be described to a couple of things. For one, people are a lot more focused and reflective on respiratory conditions and smoke that's challenging that. And then two, I think there were more individuals who were just at home, so able to engage in doing their outdoor burn, but then also able to recognize when smoke from outdoor burns are impacting them. And so those in combo, I think, could explain a spike in outdoor burning complaints we saw in 2020. So it is interesting, some of the trends and conclusions or insights you can collect from that data.
Yeah.
I think a trend that might be kind of interesting would be to compare complaint numbers with weather conditions, particularly inversions or
Like
heat domes.
heat dome.
So where you've got just absolutely dead air, and normally stuff would blow out into the.
I was
I mean,
thinking
all
about
good.
this, when Kelly was mentioning about the odors, I'm like, sometimes the air is so stagnant here in this area that you can pick up any odors. Like the perfumey ones we discussed a while ago, but it's, unfortunately, it is what it is.
Yeah, I think that just on gut reaction and anecdotally, without actually doing that analysis, I do think that when it is really hot, people are more attentive to odors or other things that are discomforting to them. And I would say, just off of reflection, I feel like complaints, we do see an uptick of complaints during those heat domes or those periods of long.
Even my nose gets a little weird when it gets so hot.
All right, so moving on to the next one for upcoming topics. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add, or just kind of keep going down this list? We do not have a meeting in August, correct?
Correct.
So the next one will be in September. And right now we're thinking the bylaws. Something that I've been researching on my own a lot that I think would, but it's not really applicable because of the stationary source, but is smart signals. It's fascinating, some of these internationally places that have done it and the difference that it has made for air quality. But probably, I'll kick that around a little bit more and see if there's any, but it's
You
it's,
mean traffic signals?
yeah, so like using, rather than just timing, actually like with cameras and sensors and like, because you'll be sitting there, right? And there's 10 cars behind you, there are 10 waiting and there's nobody going. And there's just a lot of information that shows the amount of emissions. And these places that have installed smart signals where actually there's always somebody going. Like there's not this traffic who's just sitting and waiting for a 3-minute light. And it happens all the time, even like when I leave Wildish, if I'm trying to go to Coburg, it is timed and it is at least 3 to 4 minutes. And all of these trucks are just sitting there waiting, So it's fascinating because we know that transportation is the major contributor, and yet, it's something that.
And you could throw roundabouts in there too.
Mhm.
It's a big safety difference, but you'd have less
It's-
idling
yeah.
time as well.
So go ahead.
Actually, I think more of the traffic signals, the older traffic signals in at least the urban areas are driven by what's called an induction loop that's buried in the pavement. That's activated when a vehicle goes over. But most of the new ones now are video controlled, so.
Hey, I don't know, if maybe this is a thing I should share or not.
I don't know of any time
I
signals.
will, because I
Well, the
recognize
induction
that.
is a timer though. It sets it off. It starts a timer for yellow light and speed limits and so if you hit it, it knows somebody's there, but because of if it's a 55, the yellow has to be so long in these types of things.
Yeah, I've found myself maybe not pulling as close to the car in front of me because I see that induction plate, there's one up in the front and then there's one some ways back, and I'll stop here so the light recognizes that there's a line.
Yeah. But yeah, if anybody else has any ideas, throw them out there. We can.
Heather, do you think you will be close enough to share anything come September with the orientation materials for the
Oh, I
CAC?
printed her a copy separately to see what she thinks so far of what I've come up with.
Because maybe that could be done concurrently with the bylaws potentially, or at least its own thing, just with the group, is to
No.
make sure people.
I was thinking merge for sure. Yeah, I just got it today, so we'll go through it. I don't see why not. We've got time to go through it. That sounds like a good plan.
I'll mention too, or chime in. So I mentioned earlier how we have some rulemaking that we're internally working on, and they'll be going through some of that public outreach, and that will include the CAC in terms of here's what the rules were before, and then here's what kind of the red line edits are of what we're changing them to, and providing them to the CAC for some reflection, question, and some feedback for us. Title 43, which is asbestos, and then our Title 15, which is enforcement, are the two rulemakings that we're working on right now. And both of those titles I would like to bring through the CAC to get some reflection on that. So those aren't listed on there, but something that for this fall. I
Would
think we could-
September be ideal?
I don't know if September will be quite at that point, but I think October probably, and then November certainly.
Well, unless something comes up, we'll keep it for the bylaws and the orientation pack. I think that sounds great. So since we started late, I don't mind taking time to do roundtable if you guys
I'm agreeable
have
to it.
availability. All right, you want to go ahead and start?
Oh,
Becky?
sure.
All right.
Couple of things I noticed in some of our reporting is a couple of commercially outfits have been cited for asbestos. One of them is A to Z,
ATES.
maybe they call themselves. And the other one was a property management company.
Mm.
And I really thought that, these being, I could kind of see a homeowner, hammering out a wall and not being aware that there was asbestos in there. But commercial companies, particularly one like A to Z, ATES, they're actually licensed to do that work. And it surprises me that they would be found in violation ever. Same thing with a property management company, particularly a large one. So that was one thing that came out. And then the other thing I'd like to iterate again would be, it would be great to get a lien report at some time.
Oh,
I did put it on the agenda,
It
under,
can be put off, no problem. Next time.
I didn't have it, wasn't sure when, but I put it under upcoming topics.
So we had it as a topic, but I'm wondering.
I think we can provide it as a, just a supplementary material,
That'd
hearing
be
that we had a
great.
request. And
That'd
then,
be great.
if it solicits some dialogue, then we can engage on it, but at the very least, we can
That
provide that.
sounds like a good way to proceed.
Material
Thank you.
handout versus.
I think that I appreciate the notice there of the question of, if an abatement contractor, if this is their bailiwick, shouldn't they be, understanding what the rules and regulations are? And I think that that's where inspections are really important from us, and engaging with those contractors. Each project can be very different in what they're trying to do and how they're trying to approach it. And their approach see. And so that's where our rules and regulations and our inspections, the way it works is, if an abatement contractor is doing an abatement of asbestos, they have to provide us with 10 days notice. So that way, from our scheduling perspective with our inspectors, we can recognize, is this one that we want to go to and engage on and inspect? Yes, no. And then how can we assure in our schedule that we're going out there and doing that? And our constant and continuous presence to recognize instances when we can challenge them to do better is where some of that enforcement comes from, to assure that they understand what the environmental protective requirements are and they're following them.
Sorry, but I have to excuse myself. I have to go. I have another meeting.
But,
See everyone.
well, if I could chime in too, there's a lot of details. It does get complicated. Not to defend them specifically, but just in general, that there's a lot of opportunity to make a mistake.
And part of one of the things in our Title 43 that we were engaging on or have been talking about as we've been working through what those rule changes look like is how from a structural perspective of the title, it can be clearer, not only from us as we're interpreting it, but then also for the community to understand more clearly and effectively, like what are my expectations so I can be sure that I'm meeting them. And if there are rule language that might be confusing or creating misunderstanding, that's where we're trying to clean up that language so it's clear to everybody.
All right, Peter?
Yeah, all my questions and issues were covered in the meeting and nothing new to, I am impressed with the reporting too, with the annual report and the monthly reports.
Nothing to add.
All right. I don't have anything to add either. So with that, we will adjourn the meeting. Stop the recording.